Maze's End is a card that sat in the back of my trade binder as well as in the back of my mind for 10 years. Simply get 10 gates and then you win the game. It was always an intriguing card in the way most alternate win cons are, but I could never find a good reason to build a Maze's End deck. Every so often I'd come back to it, most notably to ponder a Child of Alara commander deck early last year, but it wasn't until September that I finally found a good vehicle for it. See, the issue with Maze's End is that it's both visible and slow. Opponents can track the progress of the deck to its win con with pinpoint accuracy, and the time frame to arrive at that win con leaves a long period where opponents can apply pressure. In addition, the 10 gate requirement means that deck builders are encouraged to play a sequence of pretty mediocre tap lands, or else need to activate Maze's End a large number of times. However, there is a way to get around all these problems. What if I simply played all of the gates at once? Cards like Scapeshift and Reshape the Earth allow deck builders to do just this, getting all the necessary gates for Maze's End out all at once. This can leave a turn cycle before victory due to the lands entering tapped, unless a player has an Amulet of Vigor in play, or rather, an untapped Turtle Friend. Causing all other permanents to enter either tapped or untapped depending on his own status, Archelos is a fantastic vehicle for this sort of deck because not only is he a combo enabler, he can also help out with ramping faster as well as slowing down opponents. In addition to running 12 gates, the deck ended up running several bounce lands to give a mana boost with the commander, some basics to be grabbed with land grabbing spells, and a handful of other utility lands for a grand total of 43, not including Maze's End. Of the two cards that allow the deck to win, one costs 9 mana and the other requires 10 lands, so naturally ramp ends up being a very big part of the deck. There are 20 dedicated ramp spells, as well as an additional 4 ramp spells that serve double duty, by also offering a way to tap down the commander. And being able to force everyone's stuff to enter tapped until my next turn is a pretty sweet side benefit. From there, the deck mostly consists of draw, tutors, and interaction. The most potent of the deck's tutors is Emergent Ultimatum, a card that basically serves as an additional combo piece, since any combination of Reshape the Earth, Scapeshift, and Boundless Realms will result in getting enough lands to win. As far as interaction goes, I always like to have a lot of counterspells in my blue combo decks, so this deck runs 11 of those and 6 other cards intended to control the state of the game in some capacity. The deck took a lot of tweaking to get it to the point where it functioned appropriately. How much ramp? How much draw? What sort of lands? How should the deck go about surviving and preventing opponents from winning? How important is the commander, and how much should I be leveraging him for non-combo purposes? I spent several weeks and dozens of hours tweaking and tuning and pruning and answering tough questions until I'd finally achieved the seemingly impossible. A deck that could pull off a Maze's End win consistently by turn 7 or 8 with plenty of interaction held up, all for a bit over $100. It was an accomplishment, a realization of my past ambitions, an optimized utilization of a silly alternate win con card I'd been thinking about for 10 whole years. And if the story ended here, it would be an unambiguously happy one, an uncomplicated tale of self-actualization and cardboard triumph. However, it was in fact somewhat complicated by a simple fact. Magic the Gathering is a card game, and decks are meant to be played in games against people. In my first few games with the deck, I was kind of surprised with the way people responded to me pulling off my massive land swing. I'd get excited and start grabbing gates, and other people would basically go, "Oh, you got the combo? Okay, cool. Another game?" I had constructed a grand narrative for this deck because it was genuinely challenging to build, but in an actual game of Commander, this plays just like any other 1-card plus Commander combo deck. Satisfy conditions, get pieces, stop opponents from winning long enough to put things together, protect combo, and do the combo. It's not necessarily that the deck was entirely uninteresting or entirely devoid of fun gameplay. It's an acceptable combo deck. The real surprise was the expectation versus the reality of the situation. I had constructed narratives of grandeur as I was reaching out, striving for a powerful Maze's End deck. But once it was in my hand, it was clearly something far more mundane than I had expected. And on some level, it's a little strange that this happened to me because I had watched my friend Hans have a very similar experience a few months prior building a Yidris deck. This was a deck that used Yidris' unique combat damage ability to cascade into an each opponent discards their hand, you draw 28 cards combo off of 2 cantrips. It was otherwise built in a mid-range shell containing ramp, removal, value engines, and some very specific protection spells that were chosen in order to still get value when they were cascaded into. So what's the problem there? Well, once again, despite having a creative execution, the deck's combo was still a combo, and opponents treated it as such. In fact, this deck was even more problematic than the Archelos deck due to the fact that all of its shenanigans could be stopped by simply killing or fully blocking the Yidris, and since not doing that meant possibly ceding a massive value swing to the Yidris player, players would religiously hate out the Yidris. On paper, everything lined up for the deck, but real life is not made out of paper. A question I've asked myself is, what are these decks saying exactly? They say something about combos and about humans and about how we build decks, but that's not the most interesting thing they say. The most interesting thing these goofy combo decks tell me is that deck building creativity is not rewarded in and of itself in Commander games. That might sound like the whining of some hipster, but I'm not intending that statement as any sort of value judgment about the state of the game. Rather, it provides an interesting jumping off point for thinking more critically about the game and how it's experienced by the people who play it. An inherent weirdness of a collectible card game like Magic the Gathering is that deck building and playing are two separate phases of the game. You're not playing Dominion or some other card game where deck building and playing happen in tandem. No, these things are clearly demarcated. Limited formats provide the most conventionally game-like structure for these phases in the sense that a 4 or 5 hour limited event literally contains separate timed phases for assembling decks and playing the game. A Magic the Gathering draft, where players pick cards from packs in a circle and build decks with their resulting card pool before entering a series of timed rounds, actually resembles a lot of board and card games in structure. As a simple example, For Sale is a game that contains one phase where players bid against each other on property cards, and then a second phase where players use their lineup of properties to secure point cards. Like a Magic the Gathering draft, the first phase involves a mixture of strategy and luck to determine how good a player's group of cards is, and then the second phase uses the quality of that group, as well as some further strategy and luck, to determine the ultimate outcome of the game. This is a clear enough line to draw with limited Magic the Gathering events, but the relationship between these different phases gets progressively more convoluted from here. Let's think about a low-level standard event. In the deck building phase, players, on their own time and in their own spaces, complete the task of assembling the best standard deck they can and the best sideboard to face off against the decks they expect to face. Then, the playing phase sees the players, now congregating in a game store at a specific time, play a sequence of games to determine a winner. This is very different from most games in that the different phases occur in different settings on different timelines, but the structure is still roughly the same. The first phase sees players complete one goal, which then contributes to the outcome of a second goal. However, taking things a step further into the realm of Commander, things get even murkier because you lose a lot of the element of competitiveness. The first phase does still involve building a deck, and the second phase does still involve playing that deck, but the goals are less clear. Unlike a standard tournament, there isn't usually a prize for winning an EDH game aside from bragging rights, and even in store-run casual Commander events, the subject of prize support is one with no shortage of disagreement and controversy. Put simply, winning isn't codified as a goal in the same way as it is in 60-card constructed events. This difference in how winning is perceived then trickles back down to the deck-building phase. If everybody was sincerely trying their best to make the most powerful deck in that deck-building phase, Commander games would be full of net-decked CEDH lists, but most players choose to show up to EDH games with decks that look quite different than that. Winning will be a contributing factor to the sorts of decks that EDH players will build, but it will be accompanied by a melange of other factors rendered subtle in competitive 1v1 formats. Wanting a deck to do a certain cool play, wanting to have a deck feel a certain way, wanting a deck to look a certain way, wanting a deck to produce the funniest moments, and so on. A lot of these goals will mesh well with the task of having fun in that second phase, the playing phase. Obviously, players playing decks that feel expressive or cool to them in some way will usually lead to them having more fun, and the goal of winning will likewise produce a lot of fun moments for people. However, there are also goals that don't mesh as well with having fun in a game of Commander, and the best example of these is decks that try to win in some especially creative or expressive way. As it turns out, winning the game is generally a pretty brief process. A long period of back and forth can be fun, but when a game reaches a point where one person is all but guaranteed to win, it's generally for the best that things stop very soon after. This is also why non-deterministic combo or lockout decks are often unpopular. They stretch out the length of a win, requiring opponents to make an unfortunate choice, either concede to save time or waste an extra 10 minutes on the 5% chance that the comboing player fizzles. But okay, I'm getting off topic. The platonic ideal of an EDH win is brief. There is no ceremony where the winning player gets to revel in their glory and be celebrated for their deck building or gameplay accomplishments. The game just ends, and people move on to either another game or any of the other things that might occupy their life. Winning in that creative way might be cool for that first time or two, but maybe not even that. The The really memorable games are usually the ones where something unexpected happens, not the ones where a player trots out their creatively devised win con they spent hours creating. But spending hours to creatively devise and perfect a win con still has an allure to it, doesn't it? Despite understanding all of what I just said, I have a pattern of continually coming back to build new creative combo decks. It's an itch that I can't seem to stop scratching. Another one I built in paper a few months back was one I like to call Tribal Fiend Hunter. The basic idea behind it was this. You know Fiend Hunters, those creatures that exile something else until they leave play? Well, what if you built a deck with the goal of getting 3 of them and then having them exile each other repeatedly in an indefinitely long loop? Just a few fellas having a really phenomenal day of fiend hunting. This is a somewhat unique spin on a combo deck. Instead of finding a handful of different pieces in separate categories, you just need to find 3 of the 8 Fiend Hunters that exist within the green-white color identity. The deck then wins through some means or other. A couple of the Fiend Hunters also create tokens or counters, and 3 of them exile multiple cards, which allows for infinite ETB triggers. Speaking of ETB triggers, I went with the commander choice of Torsten, founder of Benalia. Torsten has a lot of benefits, with the biggest one being that he draws a bunch of cards on ETB, a fact which can be paired with cards that flicker in order to draw the number of cards that the deck needs to draw in order to find 3 Fiend Hunters, 37 on average. So the deck begins with a mixture of Fiend Hunters and sources of Blink. From there, most of the deck ended up being occupied by lands and ramp creatures, 42 and 29 respectively. This might seem like a lot because it is. I have a 7-mana commander I want to cast, and since he's the only source of draw in a deck that wants to draw a ton of cards, the deck doesn't really do anything before he gets cast. The mana dorks of the deck are carefully selected to offer the most utility during the fiend hunting combo step. There are 6 different ones that can give infinite mana, infinite +1/+1 counters, or some other resource that can hopefully lead to me winning, and the deck's removal likewise fits into this mold. Overall, the goal here was to have a combo deck that is as fluid and flexible as possible, using the power of Fiend Hunters to creatively piece together wins in a variety of different ways. Initially, I considered using some pricier cards in the deck, like Preston the Vanisher, or even switching the commander to Atraxa for a 4-color version, but eventually I came to the conclusion that I did not want to spend more than $50 on this deck. The logic was this. I knew that I found the Fiend Hunter combo funny, but I had been down the funny combo road before, and the resulting deck didn't end up feeling fully worth the money I spent on it. With that in mind, I figured there would be 2 reasonably likely possibilities. Either this deck ended up being a hilarious blast to play, and I'd keep finding reasons to pull it out, a situation worth well more than $50 to me, or it'd end up being a novelty that I'd get a handful of funny games out of before more or less being shelved, a situation worth around $50. Sure enough, the reality of the situation was far closer to the latter. The deck functioned pretty amusingly once it was up and going, and it would typically combo off around turn 7, which isn't half bad for a $50 deck. But this came with a catch. The 7-mana commander and the fact that all of the ramp was creature-based meant that the deck was extremely disruptible. Killing a couple mana dorks in the first few turns of the game would immediately set the deck back several turns. This deck was carefully crafted with just barely enough of any given resource to function, and this ended up being its biggest weakness. The deck just has too many possible ways to kneecap it in order to keep up in most high-power casual games. The deck wasn't a total failure. It was a success of budget deck building and a success of my own ability to show restraint and know when I shouldn't spend too much on a deck. However, it was still yet another goofy combo deck that didn't really succeed at being a deck I'd want to play with long term. The Archelos deck and the Fiend Hunter deck are the only 2 I've built in paper, but there are several other goofy combo decks I've workshopped and considered online deck lists for over the past several months. There was that Polymorph deck whose only 3 creatures were Trenchgorger, Balustrade Spy, and Timestream Navigator, with the goal being to mill my entire library before taking infinite turns. There was that Brian Dargo deck that had the goal of casting Dargo a large number of times before doing something. I honestly don't remember what at this point. There was also that time a Patron's deck sent me down a rabbit hole of trying to build Rograk Storm, a deck with the goal of casting Rograk an arbitrarily large number of times before Jessica-ing my opponents for some absurd amount. I've had enough sense not to build any of these 3 in paper, but still, why do I keep finding myself in this place again and again? Fundamentally, I think it comes down to looking for a sense of accomplishment. Let's go back to the 2 phases model of Magic the Gathering gameplay. Unlike a 60-card constructed tournament where winning is the number one goal during the playing stage of things, outside of CEDH there can be any number of goals during this phase of a Commander game, each holding varying levels of priority. Winning will be one for most players, but beyond that, players kind of need to pick out what they're looking for from a game. Are they trying to have a fun social experience? Are they trying to impress other players, to do a cool thing? Are they trying to mimic a game of Uno? Are they trying to assemble the largest collection of women looking left in the Western Hemisphere? Ultimately, players end up creating their own goals for the playing phase of things, either consciously or unconsciously, and these goals will then serve as a guiding force during their deck building phase. An underrated factor that I'd guess affects almost all players in this format is aimlessness. The human brain goes a little wonky when it doesn't have enough structure to guide it through any given task at hand, and for a lot of players, the amount of structure that the Commander format provides is an amount that puts them in that Wonk Zone. It's not hard to figure out why. The format contains almost every card ever printed and doesn't have set-in-stone parameters for what decks should do or how powerful they should be. For newer players in the format building with what they have on hand, trying to build the strongest deck possible will likely keep them occupied for a while, and this is indeed quite often to see with players who have just discovered the format and are looking to explore the limits of what they can do with it. This is because player skill, budgetary restrictions, and card pool restrictions can serve as limitations, things a player will be optimizing against whether they're aware of it or not. Even after players have gotten to the point where they're capable of building more powerful decks than they could previously, they will oftentimes still seek out limitations in some form or other, such as budget, aesthetic, mechanical, or otherwise. These sorts of limitations can be quite helpful for maintaining a sense of focus while deck building. I frequently build with a budget restriction of some sort, as this has dual benefits of preventing me from spending more than I want, as well as giving me a parameter to optimize against. I have an extra too many words to say about the subject of constrained optimization as applied to Magic the Gathering that would derail this video with a torrent of tangentially related mathy bullshit, so that stuff is going to be in an extra posted over on my Patreon. Long story short, constraints can provide a nice guiding hand in the deck building process, and they can present goals that allow players to have more fun while building decks. However, they will oftentimes be less felt within a game. Building a Volo deck, you might choose to have all your creatures be different types, and that might pose a fun challenge during the deck building process. But once you're in an actual game, odds are you're just going to be playing generic snowbally midrange. Likewise, building decks with the goal of accomplishing cool or unique play patterns can be a fun puzzle to solve during the deck building phase, but once you're playing an actual game, that cool plan won't necessarily translate into an interesting game. So what does translate into an interesting game? Well, when I look at all my decks, there are two decks that stand out as being the most consistently fun ones for me. My Rada deck, a greedy Cascade Battlecruiser deck, and my Shroom Slide deck, a cycling-based toolbox control deck. Those two decks share three key attributes: consistency, flexibility, and resiliency. By consistency, I simply mean that these decks always do something. They don't generally have bad games, and they are always doing something to further their game plan. By flexibility, I mean that what precisely these decks are doing can vary a lot and can be shaped to the game they happen to end up in. Though both decks lean toward late-game domination, they also both have ways to put on some pressure if there's another deck that is at risk of getting too far ahead. Finally, by resiliency, I mean that these decks are hard to fully shut down. My Rada deck is iconically resilient due to its focus on basic lands, a seldom hated resource. Nothing short of reducing this deck's life total to 0 will really shut it down. The Shroom Slide deck is somewhat more hateable, but it is still fairly resilient due to how many different ways it has of building resources. It has a graveyard plan, it has an artifacts plan, it has an Astral Slide ETB Flicker plan, it has a flying creature beatdown plan, and it has a hand sculpting control plan. There are just so many elements working in tandem that if one or two get knocked out, the deck can simply pick a different direction to build advantage in. You may find different deck attributes to be enjoyable than I do, but these are just three that have proved most consistently fun for me, and they're a good starting place if you're not yet sure what you find fun. A final additional element that these decks share is that their engines and interaction suites are well defined, but their win cons are less well defined because they're both late game decks. The Rada deck is looking to build up an absurd land count and then win, and the Shroom Slide deck is a control deck that wants to gain a degree of dominance over the state of the game before it finishes off opponents. To me, this goes back to the length of win cons. Because these decks have states they're trying to achieve rather than discrete plans to win the game, winning games is more of an involved process than it is in most of my other decks. Whereas with a lot of decks, the win is quite rapid once the deck is in a good position, with a slower, more controlling deck, there will be more time to simmer in the win. That's certainly more enjoyable for me while playing Commander, and I think it's useful to identify that, but I hesitate to call it an unambiguous good. Is it good for the table if I always pull out this sort of grindy endgame deck? Is it good for me to always pick this sort of fun optimized play experience for myself? At the end of the day, there is a valid place for novelty decks out there. In spite of everything, I'm ultimately glad I built both my Turtle Gates deck and my Fiend Hunter deck. They were fun to build, and it's nice to have a bit of extra variety around if I'm ever starting to bore of my first or second string decks. It's valid to have different decks that serve different desires, and not every deck needs to be some sort of optimal construct of mathematically maximized fun value. It's even valid to build a deck primarily for the enjoyment of building it, and whether or not it ends up materializing in paper can be a matter of personal preference. What I would advocate for, however, is mindfulness. When you're building a deck, it's good to calibrate your expectations and understand what the deck is going to mean for you. Get to know yourself. What do you find fun? What goals do you strive for in the gameplay stage of things? And how can you contribute to those goals in the deck building stage? Is it worthwhile to introduce constraints? And how will those constraints affect the gameplay portion of things as compared to the deck building portion? Because ultimately, a holistic understanding of the game needs to include both of these things. Deck building is playing Magic on some level. It's just playing Magic in a different way than the games themselves, and to different ends. Thanks for watching. This was an expansion on a patron-only video I released about 7 months ago. I finally felt like I had enough to say to turn it into a full-length video. If you want to see me chew on ideas weeks or months before they end up in a public video, you can support me over on Patreon. My lovely patrons, some of whom are on screen now, allow me to take time on longer videos such as this one, and without even needing to put mid-roll ads on them. Beyond that, if you're feeling inspired to buy some funny combo cards or non-funny non-combo cards, I left an affiliate link for TCG Player in the description. Alright, bye.